All right, the President of the United States directed his former personal attorney to lie to Congress. That's what two law enforcement officials involved in an investigation of the matter tell BuzzFeed News. First, let's hear what the President has been saying for 3 years.
But zero, I mean, I will tell you right now, zero, I have nothing to do with Russia.
I have nothing to do with Russia, folks. They said maybe Donald Trump is involved in projects with the Russians. The answer is no. No.
I have no deals in Russia. I have no deals that could happen in Russia because we've stayed away. I have nothing to do with Russia. To the best of my knowledge, no person that I deal with does. That I have nothing to do with Russia. I have no investments in Russia, none whatsoever. I have nothing to do with Russia. Nothing to do with Russia.
Well, at least he's consistent. But a new BuzzFeed report bolsters claims that Michael Cohen made about the president. Investigators telling BuzzFeed that Trump knew about plans that Cohen was advancing for Trump to visit Russia and meet personally with Vladimir Putin during the 2016 campaign, all in the hope of moving a Trump Tower Moscow project forward. The sources tell BuzzFeed Trump told Cohen, quote, make it happen. Now, back in October of 2017, Cohen testified before the House Intelligence Committee. In his testimony, Cohen claimed the Trump Tower Moscow dealing ended in January of 2016, a claim we now know to be a lie. And according to BuzzFeed News' sources, the president directed Cohen to tell congressional investigators that lie. And it's a lie that the president's current lawyers seemed to expose in an interview last month. When you listen to this, remember, the president said talks on the Moscow project ended in January of 2016.
Did Donald Trump know that Michael Cohen was pursuing the Trump Tower in Moscow into the summer of 2016?
According to the answer that he gave, it would have covered all the way up to November of 2016. He said he had conversations with him.
All right, and as the president,
to the answer that he gave.
Yeah, that was
not. Here's the truth.
Here's the truth.
According to the answer that he gave.
There is some obfuscating going on there. And as the president tries to cast doubt on Michael Cohen's credibility ahead of Cohen's next trip to the House Intelligence Committee on February 7th, it's not just Michael Cohen's word that investigators are relying on. BuzzFeed sources say authorities learned about Trump's directive to Cohen through multiple witnesses from the Trump Organization, internal company emails, text messages, and a cache of other documents that BuzzFeed reporters say they have seen with their own eyes, and another reason the president may be overly concerned. BuzzFeed sources say Cohen gave the president's adult children, quote, very detailed updates, something that could turn dicey after Donald Trump Jr. testified to Congress he was only peripherally aware of the plan. Now, we should note, Michael Cohen's spokesman declined to comment, but did not dispute the story. Rudy Giuliani tells NBC News, quote, any suggestion from any source that the president counseled Michael Cohen to lie is categorically false. But as you have often reported, Stephanie, there is zero chance that Donald Trump was involved in a project, or Donald Trump's children were involved in a major project that Donald Trump would not have known about. As Ari Melber said, this isn't General Motors.
This isn't even a mom and pop. It's just a pop.
It's just pop.
There is no scenario where Donald Trump wasn't aware and involved. Joining us now, NBC News investigative reporter Ken Dilanian and former U.S. Attorney Harry Litman. All right, Ken, this is just another piece of the many investigations surrounding the president. Out of all of these, where does this newest BuzzFeed News fit in?
Well, I think most people agree, Stephanie, that this, if true, is a game changer. This is almost a separate thing from the whole question of Russia conspiracy, because what BuzzFeed is asserting is that this happened after the election, and Donald Trump told Michael Cohen to lie to Congress, a co-equal branch of government. So that appears that if true, he'd be guilty of suborning perjury, potentially obstruction of justice. It seems like an impeachable offense. It's exactly the kind of thing that drove Richard Nixon from office. But there's also a relevance to the Russia investigation, because the question then becomes, if true, why? Why did he tell Michael Cohen to lie about this Moscow Trump Tower deal, which, of course, would have had to have the approval of Vladimir Putin? Was it just for public relations reasons, because it would have looked bad? Or was it because he was concerned about other relationships with Russia emerging? After all, this project could not have been built without Vladimir Putin's say-so. And, you know, he was negotiating this at a time where he didn't think he was was going to win the presidency. So it raises a host of questions. I think the last thing of interest here is, what did Robert Mueller ask Donald Trump about this in written questions? We know from the New York Times reporting that one of the questions to Donald Trump from Mueller was, what conversations did you have with Michael Cohen, his partner Felix Sater, and others about this Trump Tower Moscow project? So the question now is, did Donald Trump answer that question truthfully, guys?
All right, Harry, let's just put aside the fact that this is Donald Trump we're talking about, the President of the United States. Let's assume an average citizen did the things that Trump is accused of. We already know that he directed Cohen to make 2 hush money payments. There are some questions about whether he knew the legality of that, but put that aside. Here, it is reported that he directed someone to lie to Congress. Talk to me about that.
Fine. If this were like a page 3 report in West Virginia about a local businessman, what it would mean is the next week that guy would be indicted on at least a 3-count felony charge and almost certainly would be pleading guilty in short order. It's, as Ken says, a game changer and as serious as a heart attack. It's clearly a crime of obstruction. It's clearly a crime of aiding and abetting a false statement. It's clearly a crime of conspiracy against the United States. And whether it's subordination of perjury depends a little bit on whether Cohen took an oath. But if this is not Donald Trump, then it is straightforwardly about to be charged and convicted. And of course, that it is Donald Trump, I'll just say, from the prosecutorial point of view, makes this what prosecutors would call a righteous prosecution, because it's not simply a technical violation. He's hiding here precisely in order to conceal from the American people a relationship of being beholden to a hostile enemy, to a hostile power at the time he's asking to be made president of the United States.
So, Ken, we're all saying we are anxiously awaiting Michael Cohen's testimony on the Hill. What is it, February 7th?
February 7th, yeah.
February 7th. But already today, who have we heard from? Laura Lee Trump, Rudy Giuliani, all on the same narrative that we hear from Sarah Sanders, Kellyanne Conway. Michael Cohen is a known liar. Who cares what he has to say? They will be on that same narrative come February 7th. So is there anything that could happen on that day, even though we think it'll be a day of big shockers? It doesn't really matter what he says. They're going to call him a big fat liar.
That is true, Stephanie. And what's also true is my understanding is he's not going to be able to discuss this whole Trump Tower Moscow matter or anything else that goes to a pending criminal investigation. He's been warned away from doing that. But what I'm told is that he's going to offer very detailed anecdotes about how Donald Trump operates behind the scenes that will be very disturbing. We're told he's going to paint Trump as a madman, and they've been wargaming. His people have these scenarios. What stories are you going to tell? How detailed? How granular are you going to get? You have to sort of put the people in the room, and I think in a televised congressional hearing, that may have an impact. We've never seen this before. We've read accounts of how Donald Trump behaves. We've seen allegations. But here is his fixer and longtime lawyer of 10 years coming before the Congress on television, talking about the dirty secrets behind closed doors.
Talk to me, Harry. We've had some version of this discussion before, but this idea of undermining
nonstop every day for the last
2 years.
I think we've talked about this a little bit at some point.
To the degree that Rudy Giuliani and the president depend on undermining Michael Cohen's credibility in the face of a potential prosecution or something like that, that's kind of par for the course, right? When you prosecute people who commit crimes, you are often depending on the testimony of people who are not
savory.
Yeah, getting their angel wings anytime soon.
Well put, savory. I like that. Yeah, 98% of the time, and it always turns on whether the person appears credible and scared on the one hand, but also corroborating evidence. I think maybe the most important paragraph that Ken detailed is the one that says they have many different conversations, emails, memos, and the like. There's going to be pressure on that, you know, to come out. And an odd feature of this, and to my mind troubling, it looks like the sources are actually law enforcement, not from within the Mueller campaign, but law enforcement. If that's true, A, somebody ought to get fired, but B, it does mean we're not talking Cohen alone or even principally. We're talking chapter and verse that a jury can look at as an exhibit. That's killer evidence.
Yeah, this is important to note that BuzzFeed's reporting doesn't come primarily from Michael Cohen. So we can agree or disagree on whether
Cohen's like the punctuation.
Right. They apparently have seen documents, text messages, things like that. Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.